and welcome to week 6. We're going to be discussing diversity in the workplace, and I'm sharing with you today a lecture that I heard by Dr. Jenko. I changed a few things, but it's predominantly his lecture, and he spoke to a group of hospice and palliative people recently on the hidden source of diversity being generations. Dr. Jenko is professor of gerontology at the College of New Rochelle and has published widely with Hospice Foundation of America. We're going to be discussing the characteristics of varied generations, particularly formative experiences and core values, and exploring generational differences, particularly issues and concerns, and of course workplace differences. Now, generational differences is just one source of diversity. There are countless sources of diversity within a workplace: ethnicity and culture, gender, social class, spirituality, and geographical. So, for instance, someone can be of a Latino or Italian American culture, be male or female, middle class, high class, be Christian, Jew, Buddhist, or agnostic, and be from the South, where things are done a certain way, to New Jersey or New York, where things are done a different way. So there are many sources of diversity. We are speaking about generations today. Dr. Jenko shared an ancient Asian proverb that every person is like no other person, so that uniqueness. Like some other people, they have some common features, and like all other persons, there's definitely some commonalities within the human condition. Each generation is unique, shaped by social, historical, and demographic forces such as the size of the generation and the composition of the generation. Generations are both interactive and reactive. Each generation interacts not only with others, but reacts to the experiences shaped by preceding generations. So in order to really look at a cohort of a generation like the Millennials or the baby boomers, you need to begin with the size and composition of that generation. But it's more than sheer size, according to Dr. Jenko. Each generation is literally shaped by the context, what's going on in history and the social experiences that are in the world and impact that generation. Let's start with the GI generation. There are going to be very few, obviously, of this particular generation in the workplace, but nonetheless, many of the following generations were shaped by this generation. So that's why it's important to give it a glance. During this period of time, childhood was a time of considerable prosperity. There was a decline in the child labor that occurred the generation before, and there was an increased focus on education, not just for the privileged few, but for the rest of the public. There was a development of mass adolescent organizations, and this really went along with shaping the rest of the population that wasn't in this privileged few category, and that those groups were some of the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. The formative experiences, they experienced the Depression. They were an adults during that time, and World War I and World War II. They benefited from the GI Bill, which sent former servicemen, and they were predominantly men at that time, to college and provided housing and education. In my own particular experience, my father went into the Air Force right after high school, and after his 4 years was eligible for the GI Bill and on that bill they sent him through college, something that he could not have afforded on his own. It was expected and valued that government would have a role. This is the first generation that really has aged due to advances in medical science. It's also the first generation to benefit from Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and a host of aging networks. The GI values definitely respected authority and sought respect, demanded respect. They followed orders and definitely had the regular guy, I'm a team player mentality. They were altruistic and very noble. They had a can-do attitude with rigid sex role definitions, very clear ideas about what men did and what women did. The silent generation was born a decade or two later, 1925 to 1942, and this generation was typically born into the Great Depression. So this generation struggled a little bit more with much less prosperity and security. They were sandwiched in between the GI generation and the boomers, and they are called, that's why they're called a transitional generation. Many fought in career wars. A few of them may have fought in Vietnam. They were the first American generation that actually declined in numbers. They experienced less prosperity and security due to the Great Depression. Divorce was still rather rare, and this was the generation that started the rumblings with the Civil Rights Movement. Fitting in or being the organizational man was definitely a value. I think of both my father and my father-in-law, who retired from a single company, 30 plus years with that company, and received a pension, which now is almost non-existent. You hardly ever hear of people spending their entire professional career with a single company. There was an emerging concern with the inner self, this self-reflection movement, and there was starting to be some cultural and gender role transition, but it was still a pretty much an Ozzie and Harriet kind of world. And for those of you who are not familiar with that reference, it was a television show that was very much like Leave It to Beaver. It was Dad went off to work, Mom stayed home, and June Cleaver in the Leave It to Beaver show was always in a starched dress and a very pretty apron and pearl necklace and pearl earrings. The silent generation and the GI generation are frequently grouped together. They have many common shared experiences. The GI generation is rapidly dying off, and basically their formative experiences were not radically different. They had a mother and a father in an intact home. They utilized savings accounts. Nobody put anything on credit, that type of thing. And I hope you enjoy the little cartoon. This is a classic poem by Langston Hughes, who was an African American poet that highlighted some of the struggles that the ethnic diversity hinted at in later generations. This was not an easy time if you were not white, and very much a struggle. And this mother to son poem by Langston Hughes really hints at that. Oftentimes in this generation there are rising rates of alcoholism. Alcohol was much more common. The so-called 2-martini business lunch is not existent today, but when that did exist, and people were allowed to write off literally the 2-martini lunch on business expenses, that really did increase some of the alcohol use, especially with retirement. There was a rising rate of suicide with this group of people due to some issues of depression, alcoholism, status change, and aging and loss issues. Now here's the crux of the talk. Because this is a leadership course, we're going to focus on workplace implications. This generation was very loyal, valued honesty and hard work, and typically did one thing at a time. There was no sense of multitasking. They were very detailed oriented, and communication was very formal. Things were still done in formal memo style. This generation works well with hierarchy and rules. They understand that. And this is historically the last generation where males primarily worked and women stayed home or had traditional male or female careers. Males were likely in the leadership of the organization. The traditionalists valued work-life balance, but often saw it a challenge to redefine themselves away from their occupational roles. When they retired, they had greater difficulty in that transition than people do today. In recreational therapy, there's a value in it if the rationale is explained, and the younger traditionalists see leisure as more a goal in and of itself, and the rise of the elder hostels and the grand travel where grandparents and grandchildren are traveling together has been noted. Along came the baby boomers. Many people delayed having children till the war was over, and when the war was over, people had their children en masse. This is the largest generation, 73 million. This generation was shaped by Watergate and Vietnam, and generally a generation of worsening trends, divorce, delinquency, that type of thing. It's a very diverse generation, both ethnically and spiritually, as the counterculture movement made it acceptable to kind of be different. Also, the Immigration Acts in 1965 opened up the Asian countries and allowed them to immigrate to the United States. Prior to that, a lot of those immigrations were blocked. There were primarily immigrations from Europe and Russia, but not so much the East. So that really opened up a spiritual diversity and a growth of non-Western religions. The baby boomers were a very vocal group, all about rights and in the sexual revolution, and active with gay rights, and this was the first generation to experience gay marriage and same-sex partnerships. Boomers have changed almost every institution they have encountered. They were very vocal in a variety of arenas: schools, the military, music and media was a big one, politics, the workplace, and society. The boomer legacy included civil and individual rights and a strong support for women's rights. It also fostered the strong and sustained environmental movement, and there's a question that aging rights, will that be the next crusade since the boomers are now aging? This is kind of an interesting comic about wanting organic, local, and cruelty-free food, but the boomers had very strong values, very individualistic, and had very eclectic spirituality. They were very aware of resources, hence the cruelty-free, local, and organic push. They wanted creativity, choice, and control. They were very distrustful of authority. A lot of that came out of Watergate and Vietnam. They trusted persons but not positions, and had a real sense of entitlement about what they were due. This group of people really fight aging, hence all the rise of cosmetic surgery and beauty treatments aimed at the aging adult. I think of Diane Keaton and her ads for cosmetics that have to do with the over 60 crowd, and they have a strong emphasis on health and wellness. Also have a very finely tuned sense of injustice, and they will alienate any business that they perceive to be greedy or unfair. In January 1 of 2011, the first baby boomer turned 65, and this was a real pivotal shift. Every day thereafter, 10,000 more will cross that threshold. This has real implications for the generations following, because by 2013, when all the boomers are over 65, 18% of the U.S. population will be 65 or older. And again, this is kind of a comic about the baby boomers. They don't see themselves as being old. Boomers generally consider old age begins at 72. Most of them feel a decade younger than their actual age. This has real implications for the workplace, as well as marketing and programming. If you want to think about some classic baby boomers in the music scene, this summer my oldest son went to a Crosby, Stills and Nash concert, and the place was packed with all generations. But if you look at Crosby, Stills and Nash, they are definitely aging baby boomers. And if you look at this was Stephen Stills in 1970, and this was David Crosby and Graham Nash in 1976. So these aging rockers like Mick Jagger and people like Keith Richards certainly are pushing the envelope with staying young. As a generation, this group of people grew up with school counselors, so they are not adverse to the self-help movement and self-reflection. This generation also has concern for their parents, so that might be some workplace implications. If you work with a baby boomer, they are definitely caring for aging parents and reshaping the whole adult care market. Again, this is the generation that refuses to grow up. They value recreation, activity, and leisure, and see it essential to good physical and mental health. They embrace the premise of recreational and activities therapy as a direct component of life satisfaction. For those of you who are wondering who this little boy is, that is Peter Pan. This is the first generation with widespread technological literacy. It's the first generation to fully experience computers as routine in the workplace. And I remember when computers were introduced into the workplace, it was quite the hubbub, just similarly like EMR and related programs are kind of a hubbub today. Yet this generation was still what is considered digital immigrants. They didn't grow up with this. Gender roles are not as rigid, and baby boomers have a strong outdoor emphasis. The workplace implications. The retirement of the baby boomer generation will create job shortages that are quite widespread, and it will also skew the dependency ratio. There will be more people that need care than exist more people that can provide that care. So this is going to be a real healthcare crisis in the coming years. 70% of the boomers say they plan to work beyond retirement age. Some have to because of financial reasons, but others cite need for mental, social stimulation and physical activity. they define themselves typically by their career, and that's not what is seen in subsequent generations. Yet about half do retire at 65 for reasons of health, age discrimination, or a declining economy. This group, Generation X, is the 1961 to 1981 group, and their formative experiences are very different. They were raised in a time of terrorism, environmental disasters, and disease, particularly HIV/AIDS. They see boomers' childhood as very carefree, and this generation is much more aware of consequences. They have boomer parents. Friendship is valued, but this boomer generation has a high divorce rate, and so that really impacts this Generation X. This generation was a high percentage of latchkey children, and they are economically depressed. Houses are hard to afford, and things aren't as easy as the prior generation. Generation X's values. They are definitely technologically advanced and aware, independent and self-reliant. They are typically entrepreneurs. They are savvy consumers and distrustful of organizational commitment. They're non-ideological. They're very pragmatic. And music and dress is really seen as a divider. In previous generations, no matter what your kind of subspecialty was in the group, pretty much all baby boomers listened to the same type of music. But Generation X has a variety of music and dress, and that is really seen as a divider. There's also a decline in college graduation compared to the baby boomers. And they're very reactive. They're still trying to figure out what they believe and where they fit in. So implications. This group, as they begin to approach 50, will begin to struggle with that, oh gee, I'm getting old, and the struggle with awareness of mortality. They value speed, efficiency, and are very much a consultative style as opposed to a hierarchical. They're more open to non-traditional forms of care, and they're beginning to be parent caregivers. Most of you recognize the Friends picture. This group is very open to counseling, and they seek support from kind of friendship bonds, the urban tribes like Friends, rather than seeking assistance or counsel from the preceding generation. Major psychological disorders or depression, anxiety, and eating disorders, and really there is a huge decline in substance abuse outside of smoking cigarettes, because this generation experienced drug testing in the workforce as commonplace. When I entered the workforce, that was not common or an issue or even demanded of employers, and you saw more substance abuse among healthcare personnel than you do now. Implications for the workplace. They're very entrepreneurial, so they like more a horizontal work environment than a vertical work environment. They prefer and demand flexible options, flex time, working remotely. When I first started nursing, there were really no options for float pools and working weekends, or working just during the week or part-time. It was pretty much you work full-time and you got the assignment that was handed to you by your manager. There was no such thing as self-scheduling. So things have changed very much due to Generation X. They expect their voice to be heard. They expect their opinions to be solicited. And they definitely want work-life balance. This generation is very adamant about placing a high emphasis on balance, inner growth, nurturing relationships, and keeping fit. Generation Y, the Millennials, have very different formative experiences. They are born in a time when there's a deep interest in youth, in education, in health, in our schools. They have late boomer parents seeking not to repeat mistake, so civic virtues are emphasized. They're a very tolerant generation because of widespread diversity, and the diversity is emphasized, whereas previous generations were not that tolerant of diversity, and that can create real discord in the workplace if you've got a generation Y and a baby boomer working side by side. This generation is very technologically advanced. They're pragmatic and non-ideological, so that's a real shift from the prior generations. And they're the most medicated generation. This is really the first generation to grow up with the internet. I remember when the internet first came out, it was like, oh my goodness, what is this? And if you think about a lot of language that is so common now, that people who maybe died 15 or even 20 years ago wouldn't even know what you're talking about. Like, go Google it, go MapQuest it, hey, I'll text you. This has very much become commonplace now, and prior generations, if they had passed away and came back, would kind of be boggled at it all. This generation is definitely digitally native rather than digitally immigrant. They grew up with this, so this is a very common, complex issue that's very common to them. So that's why you'll see a lot of super users in hospital being this generation Y and not the baby boomers. They have strong technological connections to parents. It's very easy just to shoot a quick text. And they have an emerging adulthood, a lengthened period of dependency. There are more 20 plus, 30 plus year olds living with their parents than there were, say, in my generation. And this generation is also very savvy, knowing that the virtual community is very different. Things are not always the way they seem. Here's a cute cartoon from Calvin and Hobbes that gets at the self-esteem issues that are prominent with this generation. This is also a very wanted generation. Abortion was legal, and so parents who had children really valued that as a choice. This is also a very nurtured generation. There was a lot of emphasis placed on self-esteem and trophies for participation. Every kid on the T-ball team gets a trophy for participating. And scholars feel that perhaps this generation's unrealistic and high expectations may come to a screeching halt when they enter a very highly competitive adult world. This generation, again, is very diverse and very accepting of diversity. They value self-expression more than self-control, so that's very different from prior generations. They adapt very easily to change in technology because things are rapidly changing. If you think about the first cell phone that came out 10-15 years ago, it was this big clunky thing that you couldn't even fit in your pocket, to a smartphone today. So things are rapidly changing, and this generation is very adept in rolling with the punches. Just because you're older doesn't mean that you deserve to be respected. Respect must be earned and is not based on age, authority, or title. This generation's implications for the workplace, again, they're native to the information age. They're very open and sharing. They're not hierarchical, so they'll often skip the chain of command, and that might get them into trouble. Very different from the little cartoon where salaries are secret here. This generation tends to share personal information much more so than previous generations. They expect quick and positive feedback, and they will avoid or leave positions that limit access to the internet rather than complying. In terms of workplace attitudes, they want to be treated as special. This generation often remains close to their parents and sometimes even bringing them to interviews. They need structure and desire feedback. They might be dependent, but they're definitely team and collaboration oriented rather than competitive. They desire long-term careers with few risks and definitely benefits. They're likely to be loyal to supportive companies. Generation Z is just now emerging, so it'll be interesting to see what the impact is of this generation. They are the most technologically connected. It's very commonplace now for very young children to have cell phones. They are heavily influenced by some Disney images, and Dr. Joka felt like possibly this is the new silent generation. Very much connected to the cyber community. So as a kind of wrap up, the silent generation is very much values loyalty and discipline, respect and authority. Very much a hierarchical approach to the work environment. Boomers entered the workforce at a competitive time. They're very self-motivated and are hard workers. Generation X is more entrepreneurial. And Generation Y is the first generation to be exposed at a very early age to the digital world. They have little loyalty or expectation of long-term employment. No one expects to work for a company for 35 years and then retire and get a pension. The silent generation is all about building a legacy. The boomers want to build a stellar career. They're a very competitive group. And Generation X wants to build a portable career. They want to show many areas of competence and achievement. The silent generation sees retirement as a reward, where the boomers see retirement for an opportunity for revamping themselves and possibly even a second career. The silent generation will show disloyalty. The boomers put you behind in your career, and Generation X and Y really believe that it's necessary to keep moving, kind of like the shark mentality, that you have to keep current and keep advancing or else you wither and die. So this is a quick overview of understanding generations, and I hope that you understand that generations is just one form of workplace diversity. There are multiple. And when we are working with a workforce that is diverse, it's very critical as a leader to develop some empathy skills and to understand what people value and what people don't.